everybody, welcome back. What we're going to do today is we are going to kind of take a step back from chronology, and we're going to be talking about things that are interwoven in the topics of our last videos. So we've pretty much gone in order since the end of World War II in period 8. So everything since now has been in chronological order. Now we're going to take a step back and we're going to go over the 60s, but from a different lens. We're talking about different counterculture movements that really arise in the background of a lot of the events that are happening that we've already talked about in the Cold War. So we're going to rehash on a couple of those. And then we're going to talk about culturally how we can see some connections from the 1950s and where all this is interweaving together. So we're going to do a little review there. So the first thing we can do is just kind of understand what's going on in the world. In 1960, we see the election of JFK. JFK is going to have three really interesting years, very impactful years, but he's eventually going to be assassinated. His vice president takes over in 1964. Lyndon Baines Johnson is going to be elected. And then 4 years later, he's going to face a lot of opposition because of the Vietnam War. So he's not going to run again. In 1968, Richard Nixon is going to run, and he's going to be dealing with the Vietnam War during his presidency. And then 1972, he's going to run and get elected again. The other big thing that's happening, especially during the later part of the 1960s and early 1970s, is something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin is in the waters right next to Vietnam, and what happens is an American boat is allegedly shot at by a North Vietnamese boat. Once it's shot at, it gets back to Washington, D.C., and Congress passes this resolution, which is huge. It's sometimes called like a blank check. The president now has the power to send as many troops as he wants to Vietnam, do whatever he wants to do to stop this conflict, and he doesn't need congressional approval. The power of the presidency is skyrocketing. So this happens during the Johnson administration, and this is going to continue until the War Powers Act is passed under the Nixon administration that kind of repeals that. But there's this massive spike in power. 1968 is the height of the Vietnam War. Over 500,000 troops sent over to Vietnam to fight. A lot of death tolls, a lot of resistance to that, and a lot of negative reactions by the American public. The last thing we can talk about is a flashback to the 1950s, a cultural thing. There was one small group that was mentioned called the Beatniks, or they're also sometimes just called the Beats. These were people that questioned the 1950s. So when we talk about the 1950s, there's a lot of things we talk about, especially prosperity and wealth and new technology. But another big piece of the 1950s is the conformity aspect of it. So the beatniks are really going to challenge this emphasis on conformity and the lack of individuality, that everybody is kind of being mass produced, that everybody's looking the same, that there is no questioning of authority, and that we're just blindly following rules. So the Beats are really going to challenge that. They are going to be the foundation that the hippies movement is really taken off on. The other thing you can think about is all of these babies that are born after World War II, the baby boomers. Say you're born in 1950, by the mid 1960s, you're a teenager and you're starting to rebel. There's new culture, you're questioning the world, right? If you're born in 1945, by 1975, you're in college, you're in your 20s. So this is where this huge group of children that grew up in the 1950s, that has this massive amount of wealth and massive amount of education, more than any other group ever before, is going to take the center stage and actually social change. So this is where we're going to see all of this come together. This is all happening in the backgrounds of the JFK administration, the LBJ administration, and the Nixon administration. So we're going to start crossing some paths here, and we're going to keep coming back to some major events. So all of this stuff is happening at the same time in the 1900s. So just keep that in mind. We're mostly going to talk about the 1960s and early 1970s today. So everything that we focused on in our last couple of videos, whether it be the Cuban Missile Crisis, whether it be the Vietnam War especially, whether it's the growth of the presidency or the Watergate scandal, all of these things are going to have a direct impact on like the social movements we're going to see. So we're going to take a look at this in a couple different angles. We are going to be looking at social change for sure. This is a huge aspect. We can see a cultural change from the 1950s that is all about conformity and control, and uniformity. And the 1960s and 70s are going to be the complete opposite of that. They are going to be a reaction to what they see in the 1950s. We're also going to see kind of how mass culture is going to change over time. So there's going to be this movement from that cookie cutter culture you see in the 1950s to this huge, huge amount of individuality and expression. And the sake is just to be different. We'll also be looking at kind of glimmers of different civil rights movements, not the civil rights movement as an African American civil rights movement. We are going to spend a massive video all on its own for that subject because it's so important and so large. But we're going to be talking about the different civil rights movement, like women pushing for civil rights, the LGBTQ community pushing for civil rights, Mexican Americans, the Chicano movement. Asian Americans, Native Americans, all these different groups really striving for equality. We're also going to be looking at this kind of movement questioning the role of government. So all of these things that are happening politically and over in Vietnam and all around the world are affecting what's happening in the culture in the United States. So that's a connection there. We can talk about why different groups call for the expansion of civil rights. There's a variety of different explicitly listed groups mentioned in the AP curriculum that we're going to talk about today. And then also kind of how the federal government responds to these calls for rights. Are they going to acknowledge that? Are some groups going to be granted more rights than others? That would be complexity for us. We also will talk about finally kind of where there's going to be opposition to policies. The 1960s and 70s are really going to be a questioning of the central authority in the government. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? And we're also going to talk about kind of in the global context, or rather where our nation fits in the global context of who we are as a country and what we should be doing and how we should be interacting. So we're seeing this change from the 1940s under the Truman administration, especially in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, kind of this calming of fears of the Cold War and this increasing standard of living. But in the 1960s and 1970s, there's going to be a vast amount of rebellion and questioning of the government. It's going to be very different than things we've seen in the past administration, where many generations kind of accepted the censorship of the government or accepted the role and the power of the government in the 1960s and 70s. You will not see that. So, our focus today is going to be what are the major causes and effects of the counterculture movements. Now, notice there's an S there, movements. There is more than one. It's not just the hippies, there's all these different groups. An example of this would be the African American civil rights movement, would be a counterculture movement. It is going against the prevailing norms, which was segregation, racism, open discrimination. There's going to be challenging of that heavily in the 60s and 70s. Now, we'll get to the African American civil rights movement in a different video, but that's just one example for us to think about. There are so many different groups striving for equality. So we can talk about the what and the who's actually doing it, but why are they doing it and why are they doing it now? So this major era that we're going to be talking about is around 1965 to about 1974. Why 1965? This is when we're going to see the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and kind of the Vietnam War really start to take off. 1974. Why? Nixon's resignation after Watergate. So we kind of have that pigeonhole of a lot of major events. So before we talk about what is protesting and who is protesting, we have to talk about why. So the number one reason for these protest groups is going to be the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is going to be huge. We're going to see a lot of that being kind of the forefront of this different music and protest art and protest culture. There's also going to be this real big questioning of the classic traditional middle class values. So there's going to be a little bit of cultural clash between the teenagers of the 1960s and their parents of the 1950s. There's also going to be a massive amount of college enrollment. And the reason why there is this huge emphasis on going to college is because of Sputnik and this fear that we're falling behind. So a huge emphasis in school enrollment. So that's going to be one long-term impact of the Cold War and the impact of Sputnik. So we see these changes, and these are three things we're really going to see. So we're going to see this, the escalation of the Vietnam War causing extra tension. There's going to be this questioning of values, and so those are going to definitely be changed, very malleable during this time. And another thing is we're going to see a lot of college enrollment, which is where most of this protest is really going to take place. The first sort of things that we do actually see when we're looking at early protests are going to be on college campuses. It's super important to understand these are the baby boomers that are finally going to college. And this becomes the norm for many different people. A lot of middle class Americans are going to have extra income, and this is where this protest is going to take place. It's going to be linked to so many other things, Vietnam, that is, because that's going to be the focal point of a lot of these protests. That it's going to be similar. Maybe you could compare it to the Double V campaign in World War II, where there's the war abroad and the war at home. So we are fighting against inequality at home, just like we're fighting abroad. And this whole tension is going to continue to build. There are going to be various other protests we're going to see all throughout the country. It's not just going to be this kind of questioning of values. There's so many different groups calling for equality, calling for social change. We are going to see African Americans, we're going to see Native Americans, Mexican Americans, women, and this group called the hippies that becomes kind of this symbol of the 60s and 70s. Now, they're probably the most famous. A lot of people know them because of their music and their fashion, but they are definitely not the only groups. Like I said, the very first example of protest that you're going to see is on college campuses. And it's going to start with this emphasis on freedom of speech. That includes questioning the government. We're going to see this first at the University of California at Berkeley in 1964, and it's going to spread to college campuses all around the country. People are going to be protesting against what they call the corporate face or the 1950s rules, kind of the man. You ever watch that 70s show? Hyde is really always questioning the man and Big Brother and the government, and kind of this idea that they people that control this massive amount of wealth are not really looking out for the good of the common people. And they're going to really start to question these ideas about why should we follow these rules of the 1950s that you said just because you're an authority figure? That's not good enough for me. What if you're not a just authority figure? And so people are really going to start rioting and questioning these rules when political voice really starts shutting down on campus. So these early protests are going to start coming, and the university is going to outlaw them, and they're going to try to push these free speech movements away from their universities, looking at them as a questioning of values and being unorderly and just not having great conduct. And so it's all going to start to bleed over into larger issues once it's not so much what they're saying, but the fact that they're being suppressed for saying it is going to be a huge issue for these students that are protesting, and it's going to start to ripple all throughout the country. A group that you can use if you really want a key term from this time period is the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. There are groups, college students, that are really going to take the reins at these early stages of social change. Just like you could maybe look at in the early 1800s, what groups are really calling for social change, maybe like the abolition of slavery or temperance movement, or what people are taking the reins when it comes to social change in the progressive era. So these are all ways that we can see a lot of trends all throughout U.S. history. So we're moving to try to end these things like racism, like poverty, like violence, all of these very negative things, and they're going to try to change them on their college campuses. But they're going to be met with a lot of animosity when they start questioning rule. They start questioning the governance of the university administration. The free speech movement is really going to be widespread amongst a lot of different younger audiences. And really the whole idea is about the ability to say what you feel. Now, the idea of free speech in the United States doesn't protect you from getting your feelings hurt. The only thing it is limited by is if you are taking away the rights of others. So that ability to question the government is grounded in our First Amendment rights. It's one of those core beliefs that we have. Even if it's unpopular, you have the ability to say it, as long as you're not taking away the rights of other people or encouraging hate. So these movements are really trying to question the government, even when the government or the administration, in this case, the government of their school, begins to question them. So this is an example of highly educated people, of these baby boomers, these students, really starting to question the establishment and creating and enacting change, because these meetings are going to be huge. They're going to have giant marches, they're going to have giant rallies, all of these students gathering around to hear speeches and work together to kind of question and take down the establishment, take down the man. And one of the most famous leaders of this free speech movement at UC Berkeley was Mario Savio. But it's going to expand beyond just UC Berkeley. It's going to extend to the United States of Michigan, and all of these riots are going to break out across campuses. So for the 1950s adults, that kind of cookie cutter culture, that this is unbelievable, it's riot, it's anarchy. But for the students, they're questioning the government, they're creating change, they're questioning their authority figures, and they're getting actual results. One example, even in an Ivy League school, these old founded schools at Brown University, Brown is going to end required courses and grades. So what that means is they're just going to have pass-fail courses, allow for a lot more freedom in the way that you express yourself instead of going for an individual number. It's also going to end required courses. So you may have a required curriculum at your high school, and universities usually do in order to get a degree, but at Brown, they allow the student to pick their own sort of course selection. You don't have to take the ones that the university is requiring you to take. You can have freedom to pick and to choose and learn whatever you want to. And that's what this movement is all about, the freedom to choose and do your own path. Even if it sounds weird, ridiculous, you have that freedom to choose. And that's what the counterculture movement is all about. That is the exact opposite of the 1950s, which is orderly, which is conformity. A lot of colleges are going to end the premise of in loco parentis, which means in absence of parents, that these colleges act as parental figures, that they can tell these people not only what to do, these students what to do, but how to behave in these moral rules and applications to that. And they're going to do away with that, giving these students more freedom. And the idea is the freedom to choose, even if it's wacky, it's ridiculous, it's the freedom to choose. And that's what these movements, these counterculture movements in the 60s and 70s are going to be all about. And all of this student activism and all of this kind of movement is really going to start to represent a new left, a political left. The way that I usually remember it is left is usually liberal. So the Democrats are much more liberal. This is going to be the new Democratic voter, the new Democratic voting political movement. And this is going to really start to reshape the way that politics works in our country and the type of people they elect and who they're pushing for. So you'll see new movements really start to emerge during this era. This is going to change the Democratic Party and what the typical voters are, this new left, so to speak. And as a result, it's going to be a reaction to the 1950s conformity cookie cutter culture. Eventually, the Republicans will have severe reactions to this new left, and they are going to change their own political stance to distance themselves from these movements. They're going to become two extremes. Now, the new left is going to be all about youth involvement, kind of that idea of we really have to participate in our democracy, vocal advocates for the civil rights movement. It's going to be this questioning and the rejection of kind of the 1950s. So you're definitely going to see the Beats movement coming back up. And the number one thing you have to understand when we're talking about these counterculture movements, especially kind of the hippies in general, this opposition to the war in Vietnam, it is going to be the most essential part of this. This is going to be kind of the key issue that they're really going to rally against. You're also going to see all these other pieces, social values and norms, the idea of the civil rights movement and being involved and taking charge of their democracy and really taking a part of it. This is like I said, it's the number one issue. So really understand that it's even written in the curriculum of things we really need to emphasize, but understand that the Vietnam War is going to be the most polarizing issue for a lot of these new voters, the hippie movement. They're going to be questioning the draft. They're going to be questioning the information from the government, the validity of the source of the information of the government, and really seek to change the world around them. Because you're going to see this student-centered protest, right? We're also going to see a counterculture protest beginning at the same time. They're really going to kind of merge together, and they're almost going to become synonymous by the time you get to 1965, because they're going to stand for a lot of similar things, and they're going to essentially merge. The idea is these student-centered protests, even if they're not about questioning culture, that new wave and that new culture is going to become that kind of college culture, and they're going to merge into one. It's really going to start out in San Francisco, like with a lot of these beats, and it's going to spread throughout the United States. And we're going to call these groups the hippies. Now, this term has sort of come back in a new way when we talk about hipsters in the 2000s. The same general idea of questioning kind of the idea of what's hip, what's happening, like what the prevalent norms are, and seeking to change that. You can see this protest down below. At first, people are going to be protesting and questioning aren't going to be these long hair, drug using, free love type of individuals, but eventually that's going to really merge and be the prevalent theme that we're going to see. We're going to see people moving against the draft and resisting government orders, resisting federal orders, and that's going to be a huge, huge change. Then accepting these directions from the federal government, like we've seen in past wars and past decades. The big things we're going to see that the hippies are going to emphasize are really in four areas. Number one, sexual expression. Two, clothing. Three, is going to be in heavy drug usage, and four is really going to come out in their music. This is going to be one of the biggest ways why it spreads and why it really grabs hold on such a variety of young people throughout the country. So let's talk about each one of these really quickly. First, the idea of free love, make love, not war, was big. The idea of the social norms of the 1950s. Why do I just have to have one sexual partner? Why do I have to wait until I'm married before I actually have sex? So there's this huge increase in the openness of having sex before you're married, number one. The other thing that's really prevalent is this idea of non-traditional relationships between just two people and being love is for everybody, right? Why should we confine it to just two? The other idea that's really going to be prevalent here is because of the increased access to the pill, meaning birth control. It's going to mean that there is going to be a lot of people, especially not just young men, but young women practicing um, sex at their own will. They don't have to wait. They're not don't have to worry about necessarily having children, and that's not going to be their focus. Their focus is going to be sexual expression at their own whim. You're also going to see it kind of in the way that they're dressed. There's going to be this influence of a lot of Eastern cultures in their clothes. You can see in the way that these women are dressing. It's going to all be about individuality. That's going to be heavily praised in this hippie movement, which is the exact opposite of the 1950s. The hippies are a reaction to what we see in the 50s. Um, so we saw that in sexual expression, we saw that in clothing. We're also going to see this in the heavy use of drugs. The encouragement to use drugs is prominent in the music, like even famous artists like Bob Dylan. Everybody must get stoned, or even a lot of famous musicians are going to die of drug overdoses. It's extremely common. But the type of drugs that they're using is probably more important than anything, and this kind of reveals a lot of their individual philosophies. Heavy use of psychoactive and hallucinogenic drugs. If you hallucinate, you're going to see things that aren't really real, but you're going to be opening up your minds. According to a lot of these hippie leaders, you can smell sounds and taste colors, and that you can expand your mind more than what the government wants you to believe, that you can be more than this, and kind of being open and fluid. And this may seem crazy, it may seem loopy to you, but the whole idea is about expanding more than just what realism is. You can see that in the art of the end of the 1950s, like a Jackson Pollock type painting, but questioning the world around them, questioning prevailing norms. Drug use is absolutely not praised in the 1950s. But in the 1960s, it's all about questioning. It's almost like the opposite of everything we saw in the 50s. You're even going to see famous professors. This is a professor at Harvard. His name is Timothy Leary, right? Encouraging students, encouraging the public to try LSD. And his famous phrase, tune in, turn on, and drop out. Tune in to the world around you, right? See everything that's happening, see it for your own eyes. Turn on, right? Turn on that active vision, right? Don't You can look to yourself, but you can also look out to the world and think for yourself to try to make these own decisions and drop out. Drop acid, open up your mind. Don't be kind of restricted to the confines that they tell you to, right? Very extreme. There's a professor at Harvard encouraging this to his students, right? Questioning the prevailing norms of the time period. And then music. There's so many different types of music. We're going to see a lot of different folk music. We're going to see this heavily push of kind of the British invasion, where there's a lot of British rock musicians and electric rock that is going to come over from England that's going to be heavily influential during this time period. And also even a type of rock called acid rock, one of the most famous bands, the Grateful Dead. All pieces of the music culture are going to coincide. You're going to see it in the lyrics, you're going to see it in the dress, the performance, the sound. It's going to be the exact opposite of the 1950s. A great example is you can even look at just the Beatles, right? The Beatles mania, the British invasion. In the 1950s, one of their number one most popular songs, the song that really puts them on the map and makes them an American icon, is called I want to hold your hand. That kind of innocent nature when they perform on the Ed Sullivan Show the very first time in American television networks. They all have matching like bowl cuts and they're wearing suits and shirt and ties and they're nice and say, "Hey baby, I'm gonna hold your hand." Like that is like the bad boy in them is that I'm gonna hold your hand and I'm gonna tell you something. I really want to be with you. Then you get to the later part of the 60s, early 70s, and so one of their more famous songs is going to be called Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And if the first, take the first letters of all of those um, words, it spells out LSD. There's going to be heavily drug reference. It's going to be a lot of computer-esque, like synth sounds. It's not going to sound the same. It's not going to be the clean-cut boy band of the 1950s. It's all going to be very, very expanded and different and questioning kind of the realms of society and the frames that they put us in. It's all about questioning, really, how far can you go? The hippies were big on communal lifestyle, not even just in their communal culture, like in their music or their hairstyles or anything like that, but it's going to be all aspects. It's going to be about peace and love. It's really going to take its high point in San Francisco and it's going to spread all throughout when we look at this kind of music culture, we're looking at communal gatherings, like you feel the music, experience it, you're dancing. It's not about uniform line dancing and everybody doing the exact same dance. It's about moving your body in every weird way you want. Do whatever you want because you can express yourself individually. Don't just follow what everybody else is doing. It's questioning centralized authority. You're going to see famous folk singers like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan that are going to reproduce famous songs from other people and do kind of covers and make them very famous. But that idea of like, it doesn't really matter whose it is, we're all kind of in this together. Bob Dylan eventually is going to kind of discover, if you will, the electric guitar and change his music sound. But at the beginning, he's very, very, very much a huge folk singer and this icon. Playing the harmonica while he's strumming the acoustic guitar, and it's going to be very poetic writing. We're going to see people like the Beatles. You see them up there at the very top. That's them in the 1950s, those lovely, lovely bowl cuts. And then this is their famous album cover for Abbey Road, where you see them all walking across. Notice all their styles different. You see their hair is much longer. They're not all kempt. They have long, grown out beards. That's the change over time. You're also going to see different styles of rock, like acid rock from the Grateful Dead, but it's this whole idea of questioning, like even open drug references, open sexual references, questioning what they see now and trying to stretch the realms of everything that they've been told. The ultimate kind of like high point of the hippie culture musically is going to be this 3 days of peace and music festival called Woodstock in upstate New York. It was a giant farm in upstate New York that a lot of people came to. They sold tickets, and it was supposed to be only a 3 day concert, but way, way more people showed up. They didn't have enough parking, so people just parked on the road and they just got out of their car and they walked because they could. They hopped the fences. They started letting people in. More people came in than there were tickets. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have enough bathrooms. They didn't care. People were sleeping in open tents. They were sleeping together very openly. There were children that were born. There were people bathing in the nude. There were people walking around, open drug usage. It didn't matter. It was all about questioning the way things were and really stretching that. It's going to be these massive gatherings, one of the most famous concerts of all time. Even to go for an extra day, they're not going to leave. They're going to refuse to leave. You can't tell them to go. These roads are all blocked off in upstate New York. It was all this kind of epitome of hippie culture. No, but think about this, all this change from like the 1950s point of view. These kids' parents are like the people that are in like a duck and cover video or in a date with your family or in all of these advertisements like I Love Lucy. Those are these kids' parents. So it's a drastic culture change, right? And how they look at the youth. Oh my God, what does this world come to? It's drugs, it's sex, it's rock and roll. They don't have jobs, they don't care, right? All these people are from kind of the upper middle class families that are changing. So it's not like they're in very, very poor states. There's a lot of people questioning the status quo, even if they are fine themselves. And that's this huge piece of change we're going to see all throughout these 2 decades. So All of this is really building up, and let's think about where we've been so far. We've seen the Vietnam War really pick up. As the war escalates, so will tensions at home. So think about these two paths happening simultaneously. There's the foreign affair and the Cold Wars that you'll see with the Vietnam War. At the same time, you're going to see this building of this hippie movement. And it's all going to come to a really big high point. This is probably one of the most um, heightened, tensiest years in the United States of America ever. 1968, definitely a year to remember. A lot of big stuff that happens in 1968. Um, for example, number one, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. JFK was killed in 1963. His brother, who was supposed to be the candidate for the Democratic Party in 1968, he was assassinated before the election, so he couldn't run either. Major social movers are killed. Not they don't just pass away, they're assassinated. People go out and publicly kill them. That's huge. Two, riots start breaking out all over the country, but even at the Democratic National Convention, because no one can agree on who to elect at the DNC, there's going to be this massive riot that's going to break out. So it's going to be a mess for the Democrats. This is going to be one of the reasons why Nixon's able to be elected. The Republicans seem much more cool, confident, organized, like they got their stuff together. And lastly, this is going to be the other major event that happens. This is the Vietnam War affecting the United States. When you talk about the Vietnam War, there's not many things that you really, really need to know about events involving the Vietnam War. You can talk about general trends like the public not supporting it, increased amount of troops being invested. There's only three things in my mind that you really got to know about the Vietnam War. The most important thing you got to know about the Vietnam War is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The other thing that you may want to know is this thing called the Tet Offensive, and the third thing is going to be called the My Lai Massacre. All three of these things are really going to play into the impact of the American public. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gives the president unlimited power to intervene. He doesn't need congressional approval. He doesn't need to wait. He doesn't even need to tell them. He can do what he wants, when he wants, as much as he wants. What's happening though is in 1968, it's the highest point of American involvement in Vietnam. It's also an election year. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy are both assassinated. It's a mess. And what happens on around Christmas time in 1968 is the Tet Offensive happens. Tet is a Vietnamese holiday. It's similar to kind of like a Chinese New Year in Vietnam, or it's kind of like our Christmas. It's held on that severe of kind of a pedestal on how important it is. And so the North Vietnamese secretly attack and take coordinate attacks on cities all over South Vietnam. And they do heavy damage. They really put the American forces and the South Vietnamese forces on their heels, and it gets exposed to the country. America is not winning the Vietnam War. We do not have this under control. The government is lying to us, and it really gets people starting to think if America's government is telling us that everything's good and we have evidence that says it's not, what else are they lying to us about? And this really heavy movement of questioning the government begins. Or it doesn't just begin, it really takes off. It skyrockets, just like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution skyrockets presidential control. Vietnam is really the single event that is the most centralized focus. A lot of college students are going to be leading this, and they are going to be the ones who escape the draft the most. And whether it's people that have different forms of immunity, like if you are a college student, you can find ways to get out of the war, and a lot of people do. Some people are draft dodgers, some people refuse to enlist, some people even pay their way out. So you're going to see a lot of protests. This is just a rich man's war that the normal people don't have any investment in. Students are going to be protesting the draft. They're going to be not only protesting the idea of the draft, but even ROTC groups and military groups on campuses are going to be attacked, and research done by the military on campuses and enlistment. They're going to be chased off campus. These buildings are going to be attacked and destroyed. There is going to be this questioning of not just in society, but even in the military. How are Black and Hispanic soldiers being used? So even if they do openly enlist, maybe they're not going to be serving in the same capacity, or they're going to put Black and Hispanic soldiers in much more dangerous situations than they will white soldiers. So there's even unequal treatment in the military still. They have been desegregated, yes, after Truman, right, desegregates the army after World War II, but that doesn't mean they're treated equal. And lastly, as really these kind of fighting and sending of troops to Vietnam really intensifies, starting really around 1966, kind of after Johnson is steadily in office, it's only going to get worse. The protests are going to skyrocket. And so the intensification of the war in Vietnam and these protests are going to go hand in hand. I love this graph because this graph really tells you just the extremity of what's going on. And I want you to think about these years on this graph. So follow me here at the bottom. We have 1960, JFK is elected, right? Not much involvement here. 1961, we see a little boost here. 1962, we see a little boost here. 1963 is the year JFK is assassinated and he takes over, so there's a little boost. What I want you to notice is notice this huge jump right here, right? 1964 to 1965. The question I'm going to ask you here is I want you to think about why is it that there is a huge spike in 1965 and not in 1964 for the same person's power? Why would Johnson not want to spike this increase of involvement in 1964? Why would Johnson want to not increase involvement in a war in 1964? The reason why is because it's an election year. So why would you do something that controversial? Number two, what happens in 1965? The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And notice how high this gets, the number of troops involved. This is Johnson's last year in office, right? 1968, the height of the Vietnam War. 536,100 soldiers sent to Vietnam, right? In Vietnam, over 500,000 American men in Vietnam fighting for this war. Notice that huge change. Then 1968, Nixon gets elected, and there's this steady decrease, Vietnamization of the Vietnam War. So notice that trend over time. That's a huge thing to point out about why these things are happening. But as these protests are occurring, this is also going to pass with protest. The more soldiers are being sent, the more American college students, American people are going to be protesting this war. So also think about this. With this heightened involvement of the war, 1968 is when the most troops are in Vietnam. With all of this presence, over 500,000 American soldiers are in Vietnam. They're still pulling off these big attacks. The Tet Offensive is this huge sneak attack that news about this leaks to the public, gets to American media sources. And it's the exact opposite than what the United States government was telling the people. During the Vietnam War, a lot of information was censored. It would come back. People could watch, like they would have a body count report. How many Vietnamese soldiers or Viet Cong were killed versus American soldiers, and that's how we tried to justify if we were winning or losing the war. Two, what would happen is even if you got private letters. So my father, one of his brothers served in Vietnam, and he had cousins that served in Vietnam. One that never came back, never got the body. But what happened was when his cousin was alive and they were sending messages back, they were redacted. The words were blacked out. You couldn't see. The government was censoring even private messages coming back, so that the idea was that we were winning. It was popular. You have a mix with that and American sentiment being lost. Not only that, it was that we're losing this war to this seemingly third world country, but number two, the American government is lying to us about it. It really starts to question about if they're lying about this, what else are they lying about, and what have they been lying about? It really even convinces the federal government, the president. LBJ doesn't believe that Vietnam could actually be won after all of this escalation, after all of this life lost, after all of this increase of power. He has nothing to really show for it. And by the time the election starts rolling around in 1968, LBJ starts to look for peace negotiations because he feels like he can't win this war, number one. And number two, he refuses to run. The incumbent president, right? This is the guy who came after JFK that had all this massive civil rights legislation, the Great Society, this war on poverty, that in a very short period of time, his entire political career that he's been serving since the 1930s in federal government or even as the governor or different roles in Texas, that he quits. He refuses to run, and the incumbent president isn't going to run. The Democratic Party doesn't know what to do. There's riots breaking out about who they're going to put up. We have the Kennedy assassination, right? The Robert Kennedy, JFK's little brother, who's supposed to be the nomination when LBJ doesn't run. He's killed. and Martin Luther King Jr. is killed, and it's the increase of war in Vietnam, the country is an absolute mess. So all of these protests are really building up at the same time. This is just a little map to show you what we mean by the Tet Offensive. So this red line that you see coming into South Vietnam are some of the paths that the North Vietnamese troops used. What makes the Vietnam War so interesting is it's not just communist forces in North Vietnam and democratic forces in South Vietnam. There are communist forces, guerrilla fighters called the Viet Cong all throughout South Vietnam. So when the US soldiers are there, they may be near friendlies, they may be near enemies, they don't know. But these sneak attacks are going to happen on, like, imagine a sneak attack happening, a huge terrorist attack happening on Christmas. People aren't expecting this. People are celebrating this holiday. And so their defenses are really down and they take over a lot of these major cities. And at the American kind of point of view, really, we can't recover this kind of PR nightmare. And it really starts to split up how the people are responding to the federal government. They really just don't trust them anymore. You're going to see these massive peace protests on college campuses and even the armed forces in some cases, or the National Guard is going to be called in to remove these forces. In some cases, they'll get into violent altercations where, in one of the most famous cases at Kent State, the National Guardsmen are going to shoot and kill some protesters. In other pieces, it's going to be about this idea of flower power and peace and love, and again, questioning these authoritarian figures. This is from one song, one of my favorite protest songs. It's called "I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die Rag." It's a really weird name, but it's a very sarcastic song, and it's kind of like what I think the sense of humor of all of my students are, especially now when you're in high school, just as you can hear a self-deprecating humor, like, oh, this sucks, I might as well die, the world's gonna end, and kind of like woe is me type of thing. But it's gonna be all about questioning the federal government. Um, well, come on now, you big strong man. Uncle Sam needs your help again. He's got himself in a terrible jam. And this is how the artist sings it, way down yonder in Vietnam. So put down your books and pick up a gun. We're gonna have a whole lot of fun. The idea that you don't need to be students anymore. You're gonna go fight this war for Uncle Sam, for the federal government. Um, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me. I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam, and it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates, like, I'm gonna die. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die. This whole idea that it's kind of like this southern twang type of song, but questioning why are we fighting this war? We don't know. I'm just told to go out there. I'm going to fight. I'm supposed to go to Vietnam. I'm gonna come back in a casket. Come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. Why, man, this war is a go-go. There's plenty of good money to be made by supplying the army with the tools of its trade, but just hope and pray that if they drop the bomb, they drop it on the Viet Cong. So the whole idea here is even questioning Wall Street that this is a money-motivated war. These are warmongers. That we can make money off this war. It doesn't matter about human lives. That stuff doesn't matter. Again, a little bit of that sarcasm. We also see, again, this idea of protest. There are these massive kind of search and destroy missions that are being led by the U.S. troops, destroying the vegetation, destroying the homes, killing civilians that are happening. And all of this is really kind of expanding all throughout Vietnam. And a lot of the sentiments in the United States, it's not even just a kind of questioning the government, it's openly rebelling and get our men out of Vietnam, bring our boys home. Mixed with all of this is all happening in the same year, mind you. Like, all of this stuff is happening simultaneously. The major leader of the African American civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Race riots are breaking out. Social riots are breaking out. People questioning the war, people questioning why we're fighting this, where our country is headed. So the country is kind of in free fall right now. We're breaking into total chaos. This is the photo in Memphis where these men are trying to point out to where the shots came from. A sniper right across the street, James Earl Ray, shot Martin Luther King Jr. In Memphis, Tennessee, outside a hotel. You're going to see race riots break out in the city that they're going to be targeting different businesses and burning them to the ground. In this case, they're targeting white-owned businesses in the area, and it's going to be total violence in the street on so many different levels. America is really spiraling into chaos, and that's what Richard Nixon tries to run on in 1968 as this idea of this unifier of bringing calm, secure nature back to the United States. Then to mix on top of that LBJ is refusing to run. The Vietnam War is spiraling out of control. Martin Luther King has been shot and killed, the most famous civil rights leader in our nation's entire history, and one of them, probably in the entire world, one of them. All of these things are happening. And so Bobby Kennedy, JFK's little brother, JFK was assassinated in 1963. He's going to be the leader for the kind of the Democratic Party. And during a primary campaign in California, so the primary is kind of what happens when the different parties hold elections in the spring and the early parts of the year. So in the early parts of 1963, to see who is going to be the candidate that they're going to put up. And as he's campaigning in California, a person is going to come through this hotel lobby and through the kitchen is going to shoot him point blank and kill him. So now the number one figure for the Democratic Party has now been shot and killed. This stuff is, you can't make this stuff up. It's absolute chaos. So these two major figures, both big champions for civil rights, are going to be assassinated. This is going to set back the civil rights movement. It's going to create a massive lack of unity. It's going to call for an escalation of more violent measures for the civil rights movement and non-traditional, non-violence movements like Martin Luther King pushed. You're going to see the birth of groups like the Black Panther movement really escalating as well. So all of these different things are going to coalesce into the change in American culture. Like I said, we're going to talk about Martin Luther King, we're going to talk about Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and the African American civil rights movement in its own video because it's got a lot longer story that we can really peel about. And with LBJ refusing to run, with Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy dead, there's really only two major candidates that were left that kind of came to run. There was a senator from Minnesota, Eugene McCarthy, and LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, sorry. Um, McCarthy was this kind of very idealistic individual. He was very anti-war. He had a lot of support from the upper middle class, a lot of support from college students. So maybe if you go back to like the election of 2016, maybe kind of how Bernie Sanders was viewed as kind of like the people's candidate. And then you're going to have Hubert Humphrey, who was more a traditional individual for the Democratic Party, kind of like Hillary Clinton in 2016, where she was a more traditional candidate supported by the party leaders. And so Hubert Humphrey is actually going to get the nod. He's going to get the nomination, even though he didn't campaign whatsoever because he wasn't trying to run. All of these things happened, and it was kind of McCarthy and the higher ups in the Democratic Party didn't like him, so they wanted a traditional. They put out Humphrey, but the man didn't even campaign in 1968 at all. So with all of this to mix with kind of this tension, there are riots that break out that people feel like McCarthy got robbed, that he should have been the real kind of nominee for the Democratic Party, that he got cheated, and the establishment, again, once again, the establishment, these authoritarian figures are not listening to the will of the people. They're going to push for a lot of change and they're going to really start to rebel. Not to mention, with all of this happening, think about the new technology that we've had and how this plays into this role. Think about today how people have cell phones and the internet at their fingertips. They can record anything that's happening or tweet about it or Snapchat it or kind of stream it live, and everyone around the world can see it instantaneously. The same thing is sort of going to happen with the television. The television in the 1950s is going to be used heavily for entertainment purposes, but in the 1960s, we can get information on the Vietnam household. We can watch these protests. We can watch this violent fights. It's really going to start to sway the nation and show them kind of this chaos that's happening. The Democrats are going to really be looked at as kind of totally wacky and out of it. They're not going to be together, and it's just going to continue to break down their ability to get elected in 1968 and in 1972. They're not really going to have much of a chance. These are pictures from the 1968 DNC. You're going to have students that are going to come to protest the nomination. Hell no, we won't go. We need freedom. End the war in Illinois, send the cops home that were kind of being attacked. Let kind of the people choose. So you're going to see people, these students, middle-aged kids that are going to be in the streets protesting these movements. This is what it's going to look like outside the DNC. There is a march on the DNC, massive protest. This is not just like three, four people that are upset that are yelling at the camera. This is a freaking movement. So we see a lot of these things happening, and this is just one great example of the 1968 Democratic National Convention. So all of this change happening, and remember, and I keep saying this, but I really want you to let this sink in. everything that we've been talking about is all happening in the exact same year. This is all in 1968. So 1968 is a really good year for you to lock onto. There's so much change that happens there. These are photos of these protesters being arrested and violence breaking out. And it's really going to kind of shock the nation when video footage of this on the news gets sent, and it's all in home, right, television sets that everybody can watch and see recordings of this happen. And people are going to look at the nation kind of descending into chaos, that people are fighting for their rights. It's going to inspire others and repel others. And so as a result, Nixon is going to not only benefit from what's happening in Vietnam, but what's going on with the Democratic Party, and he wins easily. Really, when you look at these candidates, even George Wallace, this segregationist down here, that Dixiecrat down here in the brown, was seen as a really popular candidate choice. And he was actually, even though he won multiple states, which seems absolutely unreal, 10 million popular votes, he actually seemed like he underperformed for some people, that he could have done even better. But when you look at this, there's a lot of red going on. There's a lot of division, and so Nixon wins heavy-handedly. So that is kind of the hippie movement and a lot of the counterculture movement that's really brewing up. But there are a bunch of different people all pushing for equality in the 60s and 70s. These are all specifically mentioned in the AP outline. And so we're going to talk about a bunch of different groups that are all striving for equality. What type of people are pushing for a better life? What type of people in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s have not seen much progress, or have seen a reduction in progress, maybe a turning back of the clock? We're going to talk about all these different groups. So probably the most prominent movement, and I'm going to talk about all these different power movements. The first one is the Black Power movement. This phrase is still sometimes used today, and it's a very famous phrase. But we are going to start to see a change from the traditional civil rights movement. When we think about Martin Luther King Jr., his push for equality is all about the right to vote. In the 1960s, after kind of MLK's death, and after we see the civil rights legislation of um, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it's not going to see a whole lot of actual tangible success in legislation. And so the movement is going to be from political equality to actual economic equality, right? Putting money in people's hands, raising their socioeconomic status. And so people are really going to shift away from MLK's style, especially once he's dead, because he can't lead anymore, to a more militant style, much more aggressive style. We are going to see a civil rights movement that really starts to reflect and embrace Black culture and Black pride. It's not hiding it, it's not trying to conform, it's purposely embracing things that are especially Black. In the 60s and the 70s, you're going to see a heavy movement of Black Americans naming their children more unique names or more Afrocentric names than traditional kind of the 1950s Christian names like Mark and Michael and Joseph. It's going to be a movement towards you more unique names. It was a way of identifying yourself. And the reason that also becomes more apparent that over 50% of African Americans, these are not just like the ex-sharecroppers living in the South or ex-freedmen or children of freedmen. These are people that have been living in the North, the so-called better area, more equal area. Over 50% of Blacks living in the North are still living in poverty. And so there's going to be this kind of cultural unification, this cultural resurgence. Maybe you connect this to like the 1930s Harlem Renaissance-esque as kind of this continuation back to it. We're going to see this movement towards dashikis have become extremely popular today in pop culture as just kind of a fashion statement. The prevalence of afros, the idea of kind of Black culture and music. James Brown, one of my favorite musical artists. One of his most famous songs or famous lines, "I'm Black and I'm proud," like uncompromisingly pride in who you are. Even handshakes, dapping people up, right? And so you may do that, or you may have friends that do that, but that became kind of a sign of Black culture. It was even a way of shaking hands differently, dressing differently, talking differently, wearing your hair differently, changing your names, rejection of what they called slave names. So even if it was their last name, they changed their last name or they changed their first name to something totally different, or something much more African. And this mantra of this idea of black is beautiful. So not regretting the way that you look or being different, but embracing those differences, embracing your culture, even if it's your style of your hair, whether it's the way that you dress or your culture or your holidays or whatever it may be. We kind of see this kind of thrown onto the world stage in 1968 at the Mexico City Olympics. Tommie Smith and John Carlos have this really, really famous photo posing on the podium as the American national anthem is playing, holding up that fist in the air. And this becomes kind of this symbol of unity that all together we can accomplish this. And so that black fist becomes this idea of black power, of unity, of strength, of this kind of idea of social change that they're wanting to achieve. And this is one tangible example. A leader that we want to talk about, we're not going to be talking about Martin Luther King. We're not going to be talking about Malcolm X. A man by the name of Stokely Carmichael. He's super important. He actually kind of coins this term. He encouraged blacks to seize powers wherever they were outnumbered to whites. So, for example, in urban cities where the Black Panthers are formed in Oakland, California, they're going to encourage blacks to police their own neighborhood. They're encouraged to create their own health care kind of ambulance system, create their own protection system to help their own people, co-ops, food kind of distribution, political parties, unions, everything that are controlled of and fought for and by African Americans, by blacks, because if they are for these people, they should be represented in that sort of leadership. The Black Panthers become this really big national symbol of combating police brutality and saving the communities. Now, they're pretty much known for their radicalism and like walking in the streets with guns, but they sort of become the own police force or combating unjust police actions in these urban centers. Now, they're going to become extremely radicalized, and there's going to be shootouts with the FBI, and so the Black Panthers are really not going to be a synonymous happy name, so they're going to be very controversial. But this is an example of black unity, of black change that is really taking action that you can use to support. So there were African American movements beyond Martin Luther King Jr. that we're going to talk about in a different video that you can compare to. This is a picture of Stokely Carmichael himself giving this speech, this Black Power speech. What do we want? Black Power. What do we want? Black Power, and really calling for social change. You even see Huey Newton, who creates the Black Panthers, this kind of mantra that political power comes through the barrel of a gun. That if you want action, you gotta take it. If we just say that we're never gonna fight back, we're encouraging whites to take violence against us. They know that there's gonna be zero repercussions for their actions. But they should know that if we get hit, we will hit back. We are not going to agitate. We're not going to try to assault any groups or try to create violence. But if violence finds us, we will stand up for ourselves. Another movement that really takes off is the Brown Power movement. You're going to really see this naming similarity throughout, and you can refer to them as such. So the Brown Power movement or the Chicano movement is really about Mexican Americans advocating for their rights. A movement that begins is something called La Raza. La Raza, if you translate that into English, means the race. It's this movement for not just kind of this cultural revival of Mexican American heritage, but also voter registration, education, reform in poverty and trying to gain equality for Latinos in the United States, specifically Mexican Americans. You are going to see protests and equality movements, not just for African Americans. That's probably one of the most misunderstood things when people come into a history course. That it's not just African Americans that need equality. There are so many different groups. And we probably talk about African Americans the most because of the dark, long history of slavery in this country, all the way back to the early foundational periods, and it's been around for so long. There are many other groups that are also calling for equality as well. The most famous name, and I kind of compare him to Martin Luther King Jr. for the African American civil rights movement, but Cesar Chavez. He organized a group called the National Farm Workers Association. He helps unionize and help fight back for a lot of the Mexican migrant workers who are helping pick crops on farms out on the West Coast. And this Chicano movement is really pushing for bilingual education and really kind of cultural embracing, not giving up your heritage, but embracing the culture. And just because they may not speak the language, maybe they come from a different country, that doesn't mean you get to treat them however you want, that there should be equal protection for these people. and that this big push is really going to take the forefront under Cesar Chavez. And he's an awesome figure. He's going to do it in different ways. He's going to really embrace Martin Luther King Jr.'s style of nonviolent protest. He's going to go on these massive hunger strikes, go days and days with refusing to eat until they actually create political change. He is going to be this huge symbol for unity in this brown power movement. There's also going to be this movement for equality of opportunity and equal rights for women as well. So this is women of all colors, but really thinking about these changes that we've seen. For example, in World War II, women had a greater opportunity in the economic sphere, but in the 1950s, that clock kind of got reset, and this returned to resurgence kind of conservative values, like we see in the 1920s after World War One. Same thing happens after World War II, but there is going to be a cultural resurgence movement that really takes off and questions these social roles. A great example of this, now this isn't in the AP curriculum, but I think it's a great source. It's a book written by a woman named by the name of Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique. She questions the way that women are over sexualized in media or represented in media, and that this idea of kind of where we are. Who knows what the possibilities of love when men and women share not only children, home, and garden, not only the fulfillment of their biological roles, but the responsibilities and passions of the work that creates for the human future and the full human knowledge of who they are. Like, that's great that we live in the homes together and we can create beautiful families, but what would happen if both of these genders, that all of these people actually act and work together as one? What could our world actually become? Because we're only using really half of our population. And when it comes down to it, it's barely begun to search of women for themselves, but the time is at hand, right? Time is at hand when the voices of the feminine mystique can no longer drown out the inner voice that is driving women on to become complete. That we are keeping and suppressing women throughout society, that we need to question and change. So they're questioning the 19 values of these ideal women, and this vocal challenge is going to increase on really large numbers. So we're going to call this movement the pink power movement. So we've got the black power, the brown power, now the pink power. We're criticizing house kind of wife life that is encouraged, the over sexualization of women. Maybe you talk about kind of like the Me Too movement in a similar way. But the 1960s, you still have a lot of women working in stereotypical female jobs. A lot of women are still portrayed in media and represented like homemakers and housewives. However, by the 1960s, different than the 1950s, most parents in most families had both parents working outside of the home. Unmarried adults began to outnumber married adults for the very first time. So there was this idea towards individualism, and there's a couple reasons why. One of the first ones is biological. If women can put off having children, that means that they don't necessarily have to settle down as much, that they don't need another person to become their main income source, like a husband, that they can actually earn a lot of this money on their own when they become independent business owners or workers in their own right. So the pill has a massive effect on this. Again, the pill really first comes up with Margaret Sanger in the 19 teens and 1920s, but comes back heavily in the 1960s. You were going to see this movement called NOW, the National Organization of Women, that calls for equal pay, child care, laws against rape and actually protection for women and prosecution of men. Even abortion laws are going to really start to come up. The idea that the woman has the right to choose what is happening to them, that if they do have a child, that they have the right if they want to keep it or not. They are going to start to change society as a whole. And one of the biggest ways that you can change these abortion laws is in the Roe v. Wade case, one of the most important or probably the most contentious Supreme Court cases that is still being questioned even today, questioning the rights of abortions in the United States, that women have the right to access an abortion if they so choose. So all of these things are examples of ways of change. There was even an attempt for women to add another amendment to the US Constitution called the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. The idea was a movement, and it starts in the 1920s, really, but it really comes back alive in the 1960s, where it would eliminate the ability to discriminate against people or exclude anyone based on their gender. And this seems like a very straightforward law that is going to be widely agreed upon, but it's not even going to be agreed upon by all women activist groups. You'd think this would be a men versus women thing, but it's actually a lot broader than that. The ERA is an amendment that's proposed. So what happens first with an amendment is it's brought to the floor of Congress, and it can be voted on. And if an overwhelming amount actually agree to it and support it, then it can actually be ratified. But after it's passed through Congress as a possibility that it is legal, it is up to the rest of the United States. They need 75% of the United States. So 75% of 50 is 37.5. So you need 38 states to agree. They got 35 of the 38 states to agree, and so it fails to ratify. So the ERA never actually happens, although it was attempted to again in the future and never actually comes to be. They can't get another state. Notice the bunch of states, the deep south, that really doesn't buy into this, and there's a reason why, but we can talk about the conservative values and the changes here. There were two sides to this argument. On one side, you're going to have like Betty Friedan and the Now movement that is supporting this elimination of gender in laws and being able to exclude people based on their gender. But there were even female leaders. One woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, who was really pushing against the ERA and felt that they were already protected with their rights under the Equal Pay Act, different Civil Rights Act. And the number one thing, if you remove gender from the rules of law, what's going to happen is that even things that maybe you wouldn't think about that are gender specific are going to start to be impacted by women. So right now, at this time, only men are being drafted into the Vietnam War that's going on. So if you remove that gender specific language, that means all women must now be thrown into the Vietnam War draft. And so the kind of argument, one of the biggest arguments you're going to use is, are you also going to send your daughters overseas to fight in Vietnam along with your sons? Are you okay with that? Are they going to be put into the draft? Are you fine with that? And all of this fear is actually going to drive enough states from actually ratifying, and it's going to come up 3 states short from actually being ratified. They got 35 out of 50. They needed 38. So we also have now the rainbow power, rainbow representing homosexuals, the LGBTQ community now is what we would say, but the gay liberation movement really starts in 1969. An event happens at a bar called the Stonewall, and the Stonewall riot breaks out. So at this time, um, acting on your homosexuality was could be labeled as a crime. It was labeled as a mental disorder according to the American Psychological Society. And so what happens is, if you're caught in sexual activity, you can actually face jail time. You can be punished for this, for expressing your sexuality. So what happens is, policemen storm into the Stonewall bar to break it up and force these people out, but none of them go home. They start rioting in the street for days. There's a lot of support from people living in the buildings nearby. And at this time, if you were homosexual, you couldn't openly um, talk about that in public. You could be fired from your job. You could be discriminated against. There could be attacks on your person. You could be physically assaulted for it. You would ultimately see this huge movement of a demand for the end of discrimination against them for their sexuality, and gays kind of coming out, this huge wide movement of being openly homosexual, not as a crime, but being proud of it, right? And it's gay pride movement. That was not something that you could say before this time without not only fear of social isolation, but political ramifications, or thinking that, oh, it's just a phase, that you don't really like people of your own sex, that you just think you do, and that we can maybe pray the gay out of you, or that you can go through chemical testing that's going to change your actual imbalance. The American Psychiatric Association used to classify this as a mental health disorder, a mental disease. It ends that classification after the Stonewall riot, and over half of the states changed their laws on sodomy, and then employment laws for being gay. So if you were caught, if two men were caught having sex, that you could be charged with a crime. That's what sodomy would be. And then even employment, you could be fired for being gay. So all of these ideas of change and being able to express yourself, who you are and your values, all different groups questioning and fighting for civil rights. We're also going to see red power. So red is usually when we talk about the red man in U.S. history, or you see this terminology, especially in the 1800s, we're referring to Native Americans. So the American Indian movement is really going to push back, and we haven't really talked about them instance, the frontier movement and like the battles at Wounded Knee, the Wounded Knee massacre, or kind of the Custer raid and all of that violence that happens out west and the forcing onto reservations. But different groups really formed and they took over some federal buildings to really call attention to the movement. They go out to Alcatraz Island, that famous prison off the coast of San Francisco, to call attention to it. There are different movements and marches. So instead of the Trail of Tears, the Trail of Broken Tears, or the Long March, were these big kind of movement to march back to Native American lands that were taken by the federal government and try to this tribe unification and cultural pride. All of these things are going to go back to major places. For example, the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., or Wounded Knee, the site of the Wounded Knee massacre in South Dakota. And these massive protests happen over months, over past U.S. treaty violations, calling for reparations for this terrible treatment, and bringing about this Native American cultural resurgence and cultural pride. This is a picture of Alcatraz, where the Native American, the Red Power movement, actually storms and they actually take over the island in protest. You are going to see them kind of spray painting "Indians welcome. This is Indian land." We are going to see this kind of resurgence of dress and spirituality and culture, and trying to preserve language even as kind of a piece of their culture. And again, cultural resurgence is all about equality and better treatment and this movement. So you don't need to know every single event that happens in these movements, but you can refer to them by their names, such as the black, brown, rainbow, pink, red, and there's even another one that we have here, the Yellow Power movement. The Yellow Power movement is related to the Asian American civil rights movement. These people are going to protest America's involvement in Vietnam. So by Asian, we are not specifically referring to one specific country, but different Asian Americans that are living in the United States. So whether it be the mistreatment of Asian Americans, like the Japanese Americans during World War II, the use of different racial terms, like in World War II, the use of the term Japs, the use of the term gooks to refer to the Vietnamese, for example. Protesting American involvement in Vietnam is going to become very important to the Asian American movement. They are going to push for Asian American studies in colleges, similar way that there's going to be African American studies that are being pushed for, health services in Asian communities, reparations for what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II, like the internment camps. So all of these groups are pushing for greater equality. You are going to see people protesting, you are going to see signs, you are going to see literature, you are going to see speakers. But one trend you're going to see, and this is a really good complex understanding thing that you can weave into an argument. Now remember, if you have a DBQ or an LEQ and you want to weave in complex understanding, one way that you can do that is to compare the whole of your argument and explain a connection of the whole of your argument to the movement of a different time period. So with all of these different civil rights movements coming together to supporting people, think about the way that different antebellum reform movements supported each other before the Civil War, such as the anti-slavery abolition movement and the women's rights movement working together to achieve similar goals coming together, or maybe different reform movements working together, like the progressive movement happening at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. The last thing that I'm really going to bring up for any of these ideas of social change is that different civil liberties were protected for people that were accused of crime. So it's not just people pushing for cultural equality, but again, questioning how much power can a central authority have, taking power away from that and giving it back to the people. One famous example is the case Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963. All citizens, no matter what crime they've committed, have the right to attorney. It doesn't matter if you have petty theft. It doesn't matter if it's a rape case. It doesn't matter if it's a murder case. It doesn't matter if it's a high stakes case. Everybody, no matter who you are, if you're a citizen, you have the right to attorney. Also, the famous case Escobedo versus Illinois in 1964, citizens have the right to remain silent during interrogations. You are not forced to speak. You only have to speak if you want to. It's not illegal. You have the right to remain silent. You do not have to talk and answer those questions if you don't want to. And probably the most famous case that you could bring up, Miranda versus Arizona, maybe you've heard of the Miranda rights, that suspects must be told of their right against self-incrimination so they don't have to rat out against themselves. Again, they have that right to remain silent, that kind of Fifth Amendment right. So all of these things, none of these are mentioned in the core AP curriculum, but this is one other way that you could see that there is change in society, taking power away from an authoritarian figure and giving it back to individual citizens, individual liberties. So you have tangible effects here, like you can talk about these civil rights cases, or you can talk about these other power movements. So what we're going to do is we're just going to conclude here on one slide, just kind of wrap up everything we've talked about today. Number one, we see a lot of different counterculture movements and these power protests that are all going to use similar methods. They're all active, they're open, they're even willing to use militant, aggressive practices, all for the idea of not only civil rights but also economic rights in some cases, such as that shift in the Black Power movement. There is going to be this big emphasis on cultural pride, social awareness. You see like this Black is beautiful, gay is good, sisterhood is powerful slogans that are very prominent. So this idea of really embracing their culture. And at the end of the day, all of these protests are going to continue throughout this decade or two, the 60s and the 70s. However, they're going to face a lot of confrontation by conservatives in the following decades. So the 60s and the 70s, you're going to see a reaction to the 1950s culture. That's the new left. That is the hippie movement. That is the black power, brown power, red, yellow, pink, rainbow, all of the colors, right? Movements in the end of the 1970s and in the 1980s, there is going to be a conservative resurgence that's really going to boom as a reaction to all of this social change. So these are change over time elements once you get to period 9, but throughout period 8, we are seeing this kind of change from the 1950s hyper-conservative conformist culture to a lot of social liberalization, social liberalization and change. So understand that change over time is a great way to prepare yourself for a DBQ or an LAQ. If you have any questions, just leave some comments down in the comment section down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Peace. Stay groovy.